Good afternoon. On behalf of the Holocaust and Genocide Awareness Committee of Northeastern, I want to welcome you to today's talk. My name is Marty Blatt, and I'm director of the Public History Program here. Our week of activities will conclude this Friday, April 5th, at noon, with a student-led symposium, which is entitled Reflections on the 25th Anniversary of the Genocide Against the Tutsi in Rwanda. This will take place in the O'Brien African American Institute on the second floor. Today's presentation is part of the Philip N. Backstrom Jr. Survivor Lecture Series. And the talk is entitled How One Teenager and Thousands of Other Boys and Girls Escaped from the Nazis via the Kindertransport. I'm honored to introduce our speaker, Gerald Holden. After my brief, and I will keep it brief, introduction, he will make his presentation followed by, and he'll speak for about 30 to 40 minutes. So we will have a lot of time for your brief comments and questions. The briefer you can be, you see we have a lot of people here, the greater variety of people we can hear from. And during the Q&A, I will moderate that portion of the program. And everyone will need to use a mic in that time because we are recording this for the future. And so it will get picked up through the mic and it won't otherwise. Gerald Holden was a boy at the age of 15 living in Vienna, and he was able to leave Austria and evade the Nazis. The British, and how did he do this? He will explain, but very briefly, the British Quakers had set up an escape route for 10,000 largely Jewish youngsters by using a special set of trains called the Kindertransport, which took these young people to England. Holden will relate his personal experience with the Kindertransport. Further, he will discuss his efforts to rescue his parents from Nazi control and how he came to the United States and forged a new life for himself. It's truly an honor, and please help me in welcoming Gerald Holden to Northeastern for his talk today.
Thank you so much for your introduction, and thank you so much for having asked me to come. It's an honor to be here and to talk to you. And if you don't mind, I'll do it while I'm sitting during this hour. Well, we are going to be talking, and let me just know whether you can hear me in the back. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
All right. Well, there was in history from time to time, during dark times, a loophole, which if you're prepared properly, you can take advantage of. We had that happen to us, a number of us, 10,000 of us, when the British Quakers, as was said, set up this Kindertransport, the children's transport, from Nazi-controlled Europe. Why is that so important? In several ways. One of them is this, that out of the 1,600,000 children, boys and girls, which were in Nazi-controlled Europe when the Nazis took over most of Europe, out of that 1,600,000, only 7% survived. The others were killed or starved. 1,500,000 of them. The Kindertransport, taking these 10,000 out, would have been among those that were mostly killed if they had not gone. And their relatives, their friends, their siblings, and so on, did in fact get killed after. watch because they were not on any transport. Europe was closing its borders mostly against any immigrants. But first, let me say this. Looking at these bright faces, I feel very optimistic that you, being professionals and becoming professionals, will be able to help America to become even better, and that what you're doing here is going to be preparing you for all the loopholes and ups and downs of history that are awaiting you. So I look at you and I envy you to be in the 21st century and having escaped, so to speak, the 20th century, which was a horrible century in so many ways. For example, one of the crimes against humanity was World War I from 1914 to 1918, and much terrible damage. And then World War II, from September 1, 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland, and until 1945. And during this time, it is astonishing to think there are, of course, American soldiers to fight the Nazis. 16 million American soldiers fought in that World War II. 16 million served against the Nazis. About 400,000 of them died in combat. About 700,000 were wounded in this combat against the Nazis. Remember, when you hear the word now being used in some way, that there is this history, this hope that beyond it there would be no further such unforgivable crimes against humanity. This must never be forgotten. But in this darkness, there were some bright lights now and then, and I'm talking about one of them, the Kindertransport. Let me set up the stage for it and tell you about two things that may interest you. One of them is, what was life before this all happened? Very briefly, a boy like me in the early teens would take great advantage of this brilliant city, Vienna, in which I was brought up. And you would do things like hiking. You know, you could hike by taking a bus or a tram right to the forest. And with your comrades, go in your lederhosen and dirndl up and down the Kahlenberg, which is very close. Another great thing was soccer. We had a great advantage that we had two big teams, Admira and Rapid. They were right in town, playing against each other, and people had the same feeling about them like Red Sox and Yankees. But the Red Sox and Yankees equivalents were right with us all the time. So we could have our fun and our hatred against the others. From time to time, that was also good. Another wonderful thing in Vienna was the opera. It's a wonderful opera there. And great programs, but very expensive. And I'm an opera fan, and I discovered a way to listen to good opera in the great Staatsoper by joining a group of people that are being hired by one of the singers to go up to the 5th floor, and at a certain time, the leader of us would raise his hand, and then you have to clap. You have to clap for this particular opera singer and not for anybody else. So I heard a lot of good operas. I didn't see any of them as a child. But it was fun to do that. And there are these museums and the theaters and the parks and the movies. It was all a kind of a setup for a nice time out of school. School was 8 years of high school, very hard, preparing you for the university. No intermediate college, right out from the 8 years. So all of that was quite nice. But a key event that led up to the Nazi takeover was, and for the need for the Kindertransport, was on a certain day, March 11th, 1938. On March 11th, 1908, the Austrian government, having been bombarded by propaganda and so on, handed itself over to Hitler and his henchmen. In a way, Austria disappeared. It became part of Germany overnight, from one day to the next. This had terrible consequences. Democracy had been killed by the demagogues. And now amazing things were happening. All those things that I talked about, the opera, the museums, the soccer, all the parks, they all had signs now. Jews and dogs forbidden. You were now really changed into a different kind of a person. From March 11th to March 11th, 38, you were dismissed from your school, your high school. My teachers came in, 2 of them in SR uniforms, 1 in SS uniform. And after that day, we were not allowed to be in school anymore. And so after March 11, we were in a new universe, an amazing universe, practically overnight. For example, the new ability of people who were not Jews was to come to a Jewish shop or, you know, your apartment or your forest if you owned one, whatever, and say to the owner, "You are a Jew. I am an Aryan. Therefore, get out into the street now, as you are. I'm taking it all for myself." There were no laws. It was a time where people had almost overnight become hyenas. There is a process at work here, which I can, later on in the discussion, perhaps talk about it if you're interested, why people, as it were overnight, suddenly became non-humans. That can happen everywhere, anywhere. So all of this was horrible. But it paled compared to what was next. What happened was on November 9 and 10, on those 48 hours, in 1938, the German government has instituted for all of Germany a pogrom, a monster pogrom. That is to say, it was now possible during this time for a person to come to you and essentially have you pushed into a car to be taken away and never heard of again, to get at your shop and smash it, to throughout this without mercy, asking people to be arrested or indeed being killed outright. It was a 48 hours of utter horror. Now, you might say, why would that happen to it? And why would ordinary Viennese that used to just go to their excursions with us and so on, why would they practically overnight become hyenas? There are reasons for that. One of them was that there was a long tradition in Austria, particularly since it's mostly Roman Catholic, a long tradition that Jews are at their own fault because they do not convert. And the non-conversion of Jews was one reason, for example, for the first big pogrom in the year 1096 under Pope Urban II, when they were told, the peasants that were about to go on a crusade, go out and train yourself on how to kill people, because you will have to do that when you get to Jerusalem. So go up and down the Rhine Valley, and whenever you see a Jew, kill him. You don't know, you must do your homework, so to speak, before you get to the enemies in Jerusalem. That was the first big pogrom. The last one in Europe was in 1946, can you imagine, after the war, in Poland, where there still was time and need for people to become hyenas. So this was an astonishing thing to happen in November 9 and 10. Now, as a historian, we have to ask why. We constantly have to say, what is the reason behind it? Well, one reason was the following, that there was in common learning also discussion about Martin Luther. Martin Luther, around 1500, had achieved some things very important, such as the revision of the Roman Catholic program. And, but he also was a very desperate anti-Semite and had published a number of treatises against them, particularly one in, that was called On the Jews and Their Lies, a 65,000 Word document in which he laid out this following. You can see it on Wiki if you like to get to it and look at Martin Luther. In this treatise, he urged that Jewish synagogues and schools be set on fire, prayer books destroyed, homes burned, the properties and money confiscated, no mercy to show any kindness, no legal protection, and, quote, these poisonous and venomous worms should be expelled for all time. He also said, we are not at fault for not slaying them. Now, this hateful document was well known, propagated by anti-Semites, and it was a background for what happened in November 9 and 10, 1938, almost precisely along these lines. What he had proposed was being executed after all those centuries. Why would that happen? Well, many answers are possible, but one is an interesting one. November 10 was the anniversary of his birth. It was essentially his program, which was being executed line by line. And we are not sure about who had this idea, but the Nazis were very interested in history and in making events count. And this one certainly did count. Finally, Europe woke up to the fact that there is a horror going on in Germany, and that something has to be done about it. So what happened? There were some bright spots now. At last, the world was taking notice of what was going on. And one of the very important events that took place was in the British Parliament, of all things. The British Parliament in November, after this Kristallnacht, as the Nazis called it, they were brought to attention by one man, Philip Noel Baker, who said, horrors are going on in Germany now. We must do something about it. We can't do anything about adults because we are on our own in a depressed situation economically at that time, 1938. But let's at least have some children come over. Let's have 10,000 children come from Germany, those who are oppressed, mostly Jews, but also some others, such as very rigorous Catholics who saw a horror being penetrated in their name. There were some of them among them too. Let us at least have children between 5 and 16 brought to England, with some people committing their money for their upbringing if they're there. And let us start this as quickly as possible. Somehow he persuaded the government. It was astonishing that this largely anti-Semitic group in the Parliament in London finally gave in to him, and they did. And within 1 week, trains came from Germany to England. First one arriving December 1, second one starting from Vienna on December 10 with 600 children in it, heading for a big camp in England at Dover, called Dover Court Camp, which was a summer camp. It didn't have any heat, but it had beds and it had thermoflasks to fill you up and try to get a little warmth. Mine very often peeked out from my bed, and in the cold night, the whole thing would become frozen. But we did survive there, and we really were now out of it. It was an astonishing kind of happening. And on, the British Quakers, who were organizing this, were doing it all the way to September 1, which is when World War II broke out. During this time, nearly 10,000 children were brought over to England. It was a desperate thing. You might think about it as if it were kind of a Disneyland excursion. It was not. Can you imagine you taking one small suitcase with you, usually at 1 day's notice, go to the train at Vienna with your parents if they can, as they mostly did. You're now abandoning everything. Your school is over, of course. You don't have the language. You don't have any skills. You're a very young child. You don't have any relatives over there. In fact, it used to be that England was hated because of its role in the World War. Most of them who had foreign languages had French, not English, as a result. And so this is being a child on this train means you're essentially losing all your identity, all your safeties, and you're going into a place you don't know anything about. You can imagine how parents felt putting their children on the train like this, never to see them again in most cases. Some, in fact, pulled out the children at the last moment to be with them And there is a whole book about this, Into the Arms of Strangers, which might interest you, Into the Arms of Strangers, which is a fascinating, and there's also a film about that, same title, very interesting one. You should give it a look if you like to do it. So, by the way, how does one get on the train? Well, usually the Kultusgemeinde would set up a lottery. You come, and out of a box with little pieces of paper, you pull a piece of paper. If it says nothing on it, they tell you, goodbye, you lost your chance. That's for most of it. For some that were lucky to pull out a paper with something on it, it might say Belgium. And your train goes to Belgium, and there is a kibbutz, essentially, set up in preparation to go to Palestine. All of those children were killed by the Nazis when they came through Belgium. There was just one chance more, and that was a little slip which says England. And that I happened to pull out. And that little slip made all the difference, whether you were alive or not. So you can imagine what happens to a child, I was still 15 going on 16, confronted with all that horror. Now it's astonishing that the human being knows what to do with this, that it does try to see how to take advantage of those small chances that still exist. One gets to be shall we say, an expert in exploring small loopholes and finding some food there that is not being attended to if you're very hungry, and so on. So this is how it was. We all ended up in a big camp in England, in Dovercourt. It was a summer camp. There was no heat. There was very poor food, British food. Can you imagine having for your breakfast, having kippers for your breakfast? Toast I only got when I was very sick at home. Here it was to be every day. I got used to that. Well, so the British Quakers did a wonderful job. But can you imagine 600 people, young people like this, between 5 and 16, just landing suddenly into a camp? They don't know the language, they don't know the habits, they don't know the food, anything at all. They miss their parents, the parents miss them, and it is not Disneyland at all. So, what do these children do? Of course, most of them want to get their parents to England too, which is very difficult. You have to put a lot of money into it for an adult to get into England those days. And they would go, once they get out of the camp, they were into hostels and servants to certain places. They would go essentially from door to door, asking people, can you help me get my parents? Can you lend us the money that is necessary for that? We are all without money. So in some cases this was possible. In fact, I was able to do that together with my brother, who also came on this Kindertransport. I was able to get my parents in through another loophole. Very difficult for adults to come to England, except for one type. There's a big need for them, namely butler and maid. Well, their parents aren't butler and maid. In fact, he is a very distinguished lawyer, an attorney in the international law. My mother is a physiotherapist at the big Hospital. So, what can one do? Dear parents, please pretend that you're coming this partly May. They made it just before World War II. Wow. Very rare, very rare. Let me now finish toward the end. 2,000 of the 10,000 children managed to come to America. Out of those 2,000, 2 of them got a Nobel Prize in science later when they grew up. That's 1 out of 1,000. You know, the ratio otherwise is 1 in a million. The group that came to America, and also that England, were amazing in their productivity. As one of them said to us, we wrote a book about it, I didn't know how to stop myself. They really overworked. One other bright spot that may interest you. The November Kristallnacht, as the Nazis called it, because of all the glass that was broken, a perfumed name given to a pogrom of November 9 to 10. As a result of it, a number of people got into action. One of them was 2 boys at Harvard. I didn't know that until about 3-4 years ago. They called a meeting saying, we must do something about it. And the meeting was November 16, 1938, so very soon after number 9 and 10. And they had 1,300 students come into Sanders Theater, the big one. And they decided to bring 20, they argued to have 20 boys and girls come from German Nazism and come to Harvard. They would raise the money somehow for taking care of them. That's an astonishing kind of a thing to happen. Not 20 came, rather less came, but it actually worked. And some of them became very distinguished people in history and in the sciences. So there was one more thing that happened, that's the last thing, you know. It got to be known, particularly by Eleanor Roosevelt. She told her husband, and her husband, FDR, wrote a note about it, which was published. He said, I wish that not only Harvard, but all other colleges in America would do something like that. And 100 colleges did, because of that letter. And one of them was Wesleyan University. They said, let's have one of these very poor types come to us at our expense. That was me. An astonishment. Kristallnacht made it possible for me to come to Wesleyan, out of which I got my BA and my MA, and then got a recommendation to go on to study at Harvard. History goes zigzag, with astonishing things opening up and closing before you can act. But if you're attuned to it, you can act. And I'll tell you, what are the lessons of what I have said? Well, one of them is that demagogues must be prevented from killing democracy, as was done in Austria. Next, that even in the darkest hour, there may be some loophole and some star. And if you're alert, and if you have enough competences, you can take advantage. Another one is to have the passion to do it. Philip Noel Baker did many other things, like the one for the Kindertransport, got a Nobel Prize in Peace for it himself. And lastly, the more you prepare yourself for anything that interests you, even marginally, the more you have on your little rucksack, so to speak, the more history is going to open up another loophole. And that can be done right here, where you are. So expand as much as you can. You have no idea what will come in handy. Expand as much as you can. Don't become very narrow. That's later on you can become there. Here now, prepare yourself for the unexpected. Some of it will be good, some of it will be not good, and you'll have to deal with it. But you know, that's why you're here. Thank you very much.
All right, we have plenty of time for, again, your brief questions and comments, because it's being recorded. So I see one there. That's where we'll start.
I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Sandra Backstrom, and I'm the wife of the late Philip Backstrom, for whom the lecture series is named. Every year I come here and listen to survivors, and every year I'm more amazed than the year before that. It cannot be easy for you to talk about this, and my husband would thank you from the bottom of his heart. I also want to thank the attendees here. There's a really nice attendance here this year, and my husband taught Hitler's Germany. He was at Northeastern as a history professor for 40 years, and he would be delighted. I cannot thank you enough for being here and for continuing this in his name. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming and speaking with us. My name is McKenna Flores. I'm a history and security student here at Northeastern. I think we've noticed a very worrisome trend where we have countries like Poland passing laws that cross the line into Holocaust denial. I was hoping if you could speak to what's the role of memory and of testimony, as you have given us today, in combating some of these dark revisionist forces.
Yes. Does this work, you think?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. It's quite astonishing to think that within 2 or 3 years, the world is allowing itself in Hungary, in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, and even in some parts of America, to turn entirely to the opposite of what ordinary humanity is supposed to be. There are theories about that for this rapid conversion. You must remember that in Vienna, from March 11 to March 12, people suddenly became ravenous about their neighbors. That a school chum of mine would come to our house and say, "Get out." How is that possible? I have a theory that may be interesting. Think first about your chemistry class in high school, if you had one. There may have been the moment when the presenter, man or woman, would come with a beaker of blue liquid. And he would say, "Look at this, it's blue liquid. Now I take a crystal and plug it in, and it turns green." It could have had greenness in it all the time, but it took that crystal to change it. There was vicious anti-Semitism in Vienna, but it was dispersed and it was not congealed. And then the crystal was put in, March 11, and suddenly these potential things, potentia, became real. This happens from time to time, happens even to countries like ours, where unimaginable things suddenly become normal because the potential was there and it took somebody to bring it out. This is the problem that we are facing across the world now, and which we have to now resist for the next 10, 20 years before this disappears again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Stephanie. I'm a third-year student at the law school here. To her point, sorry if this upsets anyone, I have not experienced any anti-Semitism like I have at the law school here in Northeastern, which I was not expecting in a law school. And now that we're in this time where in America, Congress gets pushback for trying to pass a bill saying anti-Semitism is bad, when we're in a place where people are saying, yeah, the Holocaust happened, but what kind of things, what are tools we can use to combat things like that? I just heard yesterday, I'm sorry, it's a little long-winded, that after the Pittsburgh shooting, a person in my school said, well, why should we care that 11 white people were killed? And so there's this, you talked about assimilation and conversion in Vienna, which I think is happening in America in terms of Jews assimilating as Americans. I'm finding it hard to be a Jew in America right now, and sorry, I'm wondering what you think are tools that we can have, and I think a lot of younger people than me can have to fight things that we're hearing on campuses and in Congress, in the government.
Yeah. Well, you're raising a very important current problem, and one that we all have to face. I can only say briefly two things about it. One is that Jews facing discrimination and horrors now are in a very different position than in the past. Think, for example, of the first big pogrom, which was in 1096 in the Rhineland, when the Crusaders, a bunch of 100,000 peasants essentially, decided to go to Jerusalem to free it from the Muslims and turn up all the artifacts of Jesus. But they had a homework to do. They hadn't killed anybody. So they were told, go and kill all the Jews that you can find as homework prior to your job there. But the Jews were very easily found. First of all, they dressed differently. And also they were not pushing back. They had learned from Masada to commit suicide rather than send off an atomic bomb instead. That is over. So the first thing I can say is, if one confronts or sees anti-Semitism, actually, one just pushes right against it. You can't say it about blacks, you can't say it about women, you can't say it about Jews. That's the first thing. I think the second one is, we wait for a congealing of the blueness and the greenness. The time will come when, finally, people will see that a backlash is not enough. We have to organize. We must really be on the front page of the New York Times every night, every time it's necessary. There's a big scale. That congealing is going to happen sooner or later, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very warmly for sharing your story with us. And Ms. Backstrom, thank you for being here and for lending your name to this annual occasion. The introduction that was given you in your own self-presentation was extremely modest. So I am hoping that you will indulge us by telling a little more of your story, and that is something of your career trajectory after, I assume, a doctorate at Harvard, something of the extension of your family in the years since, and something of what became of your parents once they, after the war, I understand, you were brought to Wesleyan. What happened to the rest of your family? You also said that of those that tiny percentage of children who lived, two became Nobelists, that there was psychologically a kind of drive which clearly you embodied. I did the math. If you were 15 in 1939, everybody figure this out. Look at the amazing person we're seeing before us. If you think that something of that trauma created a drivenness among the survivors, and if that's all good.
Yeah. Well, let me start with this, with the last one. Most of the surviving children became rapid adults, sometimes within a week or so. In my case, and you asked me to be personal, in my case, my father was a lawyer, and therefore he had conquered in a lawsuit against somebody who became a big Nazi and now was after him in revenge, so he had to flee and hide. And and the house now needed somebody to take care of immigration if it was possible. Through to America, for example, get a visum. So I, at 15, later 16, and my brother at 14, the two of us were tasked ourselves with the idea of getting into the embassy and getting on the list to be allowed to come to America. Instant adulthood is one aspect that happens at the loss of childhood, of course, which is a psychological problem. Many people who became very well-known and great figures quietly suffered from traumatic stress for the rest of their lives every night. So everything has its costs. That's the one thing. As to myself, very briefly, I had the enormous luck at Wesleyan to become the research assistant to a wonderful physicist, W.G. Cady. And I became his assistant in the laboratory. We discovered some things together which were publishable while I was still an undergraduate. And he became, so to speak, my mentor. Look out for mentors. Look out for the handrail upstairs. You need your mentors. You need to keep in touch with them, to tell them what you're doing, what you're not doing, what you cannot do, what you hope to do. Be in touch with your mentors. If you have none, go and find some. You'll need it. That's something that worked for me. Cady sent a note to the Harvard people that they might need my work, which I'd learned from him, which they did. So I was allowed to become a graduate student after the war. I had 2 years of war laboratory during which I taught radar to essentially to used car salesmen who were becoming in charge of their destroyer going to Japan. But they had to fix their radar. And so we, in 6 weeks, had to tell them how to deal with electronics. And that was a very fascinating thing that one could do under stress. You can do amazing more things than you believe. There are many more hidden resources in people that they can stumble on or should examine themselves. So at Harvard, I was asked to stay on as an instructor. I found my wonderful wife, Nina. We have been married 72 years now, going on 73. And, and yeah, she is a sculptor. And so the history of science department needed someone who knows the history of physics, so I was split, and I'm partly physics and partly history of science, and have had some very nice students. Anything else?
I think maybe also about your parents briefly, what happened with and
Ah,
your
yes.
brother.
Very important about my parents. Well, my brother, well, he was wonderful. He was streetwise in a way which I just am not at all. For example, when he heard that I had gotten a fellowship to go to Wesleyan, he said, "Who gave it to you?" I told him where it was. "I'm going to go there and talk to them." Right? Did. He said, "You did it for my brother. Now do it for me." Which they did. So he got his degree, he became a CPA. He got into the army. 15,000 of the refugee boys in America were put into the army, and then got the GI Bill and got colleges, and therefore started to rise. So that was my brother, who unfortunately he died 4 years ago in February in a VA hospital. My parents, very interesting. They came in their 40s, America, in their 40s. I came in my 18s. A lawyer coming and a physiotherapist coming into America in their 40s on June 1940. The country in 1940 has two aspects. One is, it is a terrible place economically. Lynching is still going on until 1950. Anti-Semitism is rampant. The newspapers are always saying, you know, no Jews are allowed in theater productions or in hotels. Radios are full of anti-Semitic things. The blacks are in terrible shape there. And yet, for people who can still do things themselves, there is an idea of America, which is very important. People would say to me, seeing my bad accent, "You come from America, come to America from abroad. How do you like America?" Nobody says this now. How do you like America? There was this idea of America. FDR, Roosevelt, the president, had implanted it with his 4 freedoms, with his wonderful speeches, with his Social Security of 1935. You know, Social Security. Socialism couldn't happen now. So America was, in a way, something that was going to happen, and people had it in their mind despite all the present. That is wonderful. But people like my parents coming, he can't be a lawyer here. She cannot get a certificate to be a physiotherapist. They are, unlike their 2 boys, they are really depressed afterwards. So the adults had a very tough time on the whole compared to the kids. America is very good for people your age. So take advantage of it.
Straight back, if you could just hand it right straight back.
Hi, thank you for coming. So I was just wondering if when you came to the United States, you felt the need to hide your Jewish identity to avoid discrimination.
The opposite happened, actually, to us. Very rarely did I come across anti-Semitism. There was one teacher at Wesleyan who, at the end of the first year, came up to me, a history professor, I had taken his class. He says, "Holden, you know, I'm recommending people to Phi Beta Kappa. I'm not recommending you, because people like you get it anyway all the time. And I said to him, in honesty, dear professor, please tell me, what is Phi Beta Kappa? I had no idea. So that was one of the very rare incidents of my facing some anti-Semitism. I said the opposite happened. When we were walking down the road, the family of ours, coming from blacked out, war-torn Europe into lit up Broadway, New York, fantastic. Lights are still on. We talked to each other. People accosted us saying, "Get away, you Nazis." Anybody who speaks German was a Nazi to them. And there were lots of Nazis around, of course. Lindbergh was running on the first bay as a presidential contender on that basis. So the older generation had tough time on the whole.
Thank you so much, Dr. Holden, for being with us today. I just have a question on what we can do on the community level as students today to combat anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred, in your experience.
Well, both proactive when it happens, and you have to do it, and thinking about what the next step is as a group. When you encounter it, I said before, if you encounter it, then very strongly disagree with it. I don't mean fist fights, but I mean trying to get to people to understand that normality is not that sort at all. This is not going to be our normality. But on the other hand, there has to be organizations of it. You have a wonderful organization here. There's nothing like it at Harvard, and I'm bringing back the idea. You have already in this group a wonderful opportunity for actions of a reasonable sort. So I would say that this being a college, therefore it values knowledge. When ignorance is being perpetrated against Jews, then one consults with a group how to react to it and get on the front pages of the papers with your ideas. I think it is, think of how much can be done with relatively little if you have enough passion. Think of the Me Too movement. Who would have thought there is such a movement 5 years ago? Now, obviously. Think of the idea of gay people. We didn't talk about that. Now you know that this is a very important part of our humanity. These things can be changed. They can be changed. They has been changed for the good, sometimes for the bad. And it had been changed by organizing and having one's passion pull you through. It takes a lot of work. It's done on the other side too. Think of Hitler. In 1919, he was nobody. He was a corporal from the army that had been defeated. He worked on it until 1933, from 1919 to 1933, a long time, to get hold of the government. Not by himself, with his group itself. It can be done for the bad as well. So let's do it for the good.
Thank you. My name is Hannah. I was just wondering if we wanted to help a group of people like the Quakers decided to do, what group of people would you say we should help?
Well, I became a member of a branch of the Quakers in England. I went to their first day meetings. The wider Quaker Fellowship was called. And
there are lots of us. They have abandoned it very recently in America. I think it's still going on in the American Quakers are very different from the British ones. And, Nixon was a Quaker, Hoover was a Quaker. Not very examples. But they're very lovely people as well. But it's a different feeling.
For many years, sitting the first day meeting, it's not what it was in England. So I don't think you can look for that group. But it's astonishing how opportunities exist before you really look for them. And I would say that in a group like this, there might be, 20, 30 people that one can say, let's gather together in a cafe house, if there is one, and have a talk every Tuesday on where we should go next, and bring out from oneself what is the next good step, rather than waiting for someone else to put it in your head. Thank you.
Then we saw over here somewhere, wasn't there? Oh, here. Okay. Do we? All right. Well, let's stop there, and then we'll go there. Okay. Go ahead.
My name is Alex Kern. I direct the Center for Spirituality, Dialogue, and Service here, and I'm a Quaker. So I was glad to learn of the experience of the British friends and your connection. I'd say one of the bases for organizing for peace and justice among Quakers, and many of us here, is interfaith. What do you see as the shared values of the world's religions that might inspire rescuing in our own time, or solidarity work in our own time? What is the best of humanity that can be drawn out?
Well, first of all, let me congratulate you on being a Quaker, which is a wonderful group of people. In answer to your direct question, let me say that you really can't put things out of thin air. You have to look what is already inside you that you can amplify. And you can try it at your next first day meeting to see how can we as a group amplify for social service, which is what the British Quakers did. They didn't talk. You know, in a Quaker meeting, you may not know, in a British Quaker meeting, and in most Americans, I was a member for a little while as well, there's no priest there. There's no biblical text to be discussed. There is silence, above all, until there is an urge within one to speak about usually a social problem that needs to be fixed. That's the British way. About an event that happened and which is threatening to them, and they need a warning. So it is really a communal kind of action which can do beautiful things to one's spiritual life. And that cannot, I think, be implanted on any other group out of thin air. They would have to have the long and terrible history of brutality against the Quakers and how to rise out of it before they can do that. So I would say that we can do something, but not always what the Quakers have done. Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, it may eventually. Mr. Holden, I want to say again, thank you very much. This is a very important thing you're doing. Thank you for speaking today.
Grateful to you.
I am of primarily Eastern European Jewish heritage. My family immigrated to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century, but we left a lot of people behind who did not make it through 1933 through 1945. I would ask you the same question I myself personally struggle with sometimes, which is when it comes to sort of the everyday members of the Third Reich, infantrymen in the Wehrmacht or guards at labor camps, how personally responsible do you hold them to be in what happened to Jews, Catholics, blacks, cripples, members of the LGBTQ community in Nazi Germany during that time period?
Well, you know, of course, their fascination with eugenics and with the fables from old times that the Nazis adopted all kinds of very strange ideas. For example, Himmler, the worst of them, one of the worst of them, in charge of the SS, he thought that the world was created by a collision between the cold and the heat, the ice being the cold, and he had a theory of the ice being the beginning of the Aryan people, whereas the others were in the heat and they were to be destroyed. So a curious kind of fable took hold of his mind, and it is only indicating of what happens to quite a number of people, that they fall for a strange kind of a feeling or idea, and with enough passion can communicate it effectively to other people. But I think that you, in your question, are simply testifying to the fact that there is a great deal more to be done yet before one is happy in this country. And just now, one has to be very vocal. One has to be able to combat with real passion anything that interferes with one's own safety and work, for that matter. So it's the kind of thing that I'm doing right here. There must be other things like that which each of us can do. They don't have to be for groups as wonderful as this, but they can be perhaps for small groups where you invite yourself into a discussion with them. We have these many, many lectures in our universities, and during the lecture time there's also a question of answers just like this. It is during the lecture time that you can make an important statement that will be remembered. In other words, become public instead of becoming concerned only about your own self, within yourself. We have to be outside, and as much as possible. One has to learn that. You know, Aristotle wrote a book on rhetoric, very interesting. 3 things, he says, have to have before you can get anywhere with your message. One is you have to have a very good reputation, that you're a sound person. Secondly, you have to present yourself in a pleasant sort of way. Third, you have to have your facts straight. And if you have your facts straight, no matter how powerful an attack would be, as long as the facts can be shown, they will eventually take over. That's my faith.
We have time for 1 or 2 more. You do have, 'cause I know that you have to head for class, or many of you do. All right, not seeing more, we let us thank our presenter once again.